that same thing. So I would say somewhere between 35 and 50 for us.
Right, I think
Well,
we
it
have
is
35 now.
Right.
And the
35
maximum
now.
will probably be 50, if you look at other communities. So I'm saying, that for Atherton, since we're supposed to be one of the better heeled cities, then we probably should shoot for 50% as a conservatism.
Now, we could use that 50%.
For anything.
For anything.
But our income, our property tax is in arrears by 18 months, right? We're back from, the number we're receiving is really
Yeah.
behind.
18 months behind, yeah.
So the numbers we're receiving, or should be receiving shortly, we hope, should be at least a 7% increase.
Well, we saw 9 for the last.
Or
Less
nine.
than two, you know, less
It's
than
all-
So
Nine
are we
last year.
anticipating and
Well, we
reflecting that?
budgeted 3, didn't we?
We budgeted
Yeah, we only
for because we're
budgeted-
budgeting
Right,
very
yeah.
so
conservative.
are we reflecting the differential between the two?
No,
Yeah.
no.
We should be.
But that would be some sort of a guarantee, which we're not gonna.
Yeah.
We're just real conservative on financial projections.
Yeah, the other 6% is not, that's not something you can take to the bank.
But it isn't something that can be withheld from us either.
Well, no, but if you look at last year's projects that generated that 9%, some of those were very unusual. The Roberts transaction, and there were 2 or 3 of them that are not likely to occur every year. So I think that 9% was an aberration and will not occur. And the council is more knowledgeable, but that's my view.
But it is, to some extent, taken into account because these numbers are calculated based on what we have in the bank at the revenues over expenditures and our projection. So if we receive more,
End of it, yeah.
those numbers are higher.
But your expenses were projected higher than
Typically, we project our
normal.
expenses.
So if you're projecting higher than normal expenses and lower than normal on income, wouldn't you have a differential that should meet what you're looking
A
for?
differential what?
There should be a very big differential between the two. It should be at least not 3%, but close to 6%. Just between the two.
Well, it's, you know, they're all estimates and
Yeah.
judgment, and I think the error would be on the conservative side rather than be on the
No
aggressive.
problem with that, but erring at 1% versus maybe 4 is a huge
Why
difference.
not, we're doing 3, aren't we? I mean, we're not doing 1.
I'm
Where are you
really
getting
saying,
one? Is that-
I'm saying the difference of what you're looking at
The
versus
gap.
what you really have to work with. You have to use real numbers. Obviously, we don't have all real numbers, but being overly conservative.
Well, we had a budget, we've got a budget, we made some assumptions, and you're challenging those assumptions in the budget. I mean, we have a budget for next year that's based on 3%.
Which we know is slightly overstated.
Well,
it's a higher than
but we
normal.
should have addressed that in the budget. I'm saying you can't, I don't think you can go back in fairness and go back and change that when we've got it in our budget.
You're looking at something for each year allocation for a 5-year period, correct?
Well, we are,
Okay, so in projecting for the future and choosing how much you wish to spend and how you're allocating your funds, we all know that the revenue coming in is 18 months in arrears of what reality is, right? Right. So that number cannot be taken away. As much as I realize it's a projection, I know that it's coming. We can map that against our existing income coming in, and you should have no more than a flex of 1 to 3% from that number, plus or minus. In doing that, I think you still have 6% of hard money that you can count upon, meaning a better, lower budget number, real number, versus the 2-3 flex you have at the moment, and an increase in income, not 9%, but maybe 6%, you're gonna hard off around 6% in total. I believe so.
well, I
And the way
certainly
I've-
respect your
what I've
opinion, and
seen
I'm
so
saying
far.
that in the budget, we assumed that it wouldn't be that. So they're both opinions, we don't know. So I don't want to disagree with you, because it's your opinion versus mine, but the budget, the consensus was 3%. So, I mean, if neither one of us know for sure what it is.
But if I can add, like City Manager Rodriguez said, even if it comes in more than what we expected, we're still gonna get 15% of whatever more it is put to reserves. Whether it's, the 15 for emergency, another 20 for our unassigned. That was set aside for contingencies, so that's 35%. So if it comes in higher, okay, we're getting that more towards our reserves. But I think, you know, we can look at, if we're at 35, maybe we go to 40, 45%. We don't know, but that's something that, you know, I think we can bounce around and say, you know, as our needs change or needs outlook going in the future, if we kind of do a combination of both, of all three, I think we'll help our reserve policy, we'll definitely help our capital projects if we decide we put some aside. And then as well for our CalPERS and for our OPEB, if we said, okay, let's come up with recommendations of how to meet all three, not one over the other, but kind of start somewhere. I think that's important.
But I definitely agree with the pothole, the personal opinions of the people that came up to the stand were very clear. You better keep my roads up to date. And I think that's what they see, they don't see anything else. When you say there's a surplus, of course they say, well, you know, of course it's a surplus, you know, look at my property tax, right? But if you don't keep up to date with that, that's gonna be a key factor. As soon as we do a pothole, we end up cutting the road again and running a gas line for the next construction house. Then we end up having to repave the whole thing all over again, then we cut a hole again and doing the same thing over and over again. It's very frustrating, I'm sure, as a budget. What's a real budget, right? But the roads is all anybody visibly sees and does not like it when your brand new car gets dinged, right?
Yeah.
So you have to pay attention to that, and that's one analysis that I've never seen in, I don't know if it's in which budget you have it, but what is the long-term replacement for a road resurfacing? Is it require enhancement within 3 years? Is it require enhancement within 5 years? And that replacement cost. And I think that is something not explained to the public as well. You have to tell them, look, we're going to spend this money this way, but we're going to ask for it again 3 years from now because no surface survives longer than X. And so they understand it. Because that's the other thing, I don't think it's explained.
Might I interject? I think that roadway-wise, if I'm incorrect, George, correct me, is that we're almost Class A. I think our target zone is on reserve funds is major capital improvements. So we already have allocated funds for and a roadway program to make sure all resurfacing and the Detroit potholes are filled. So I mean, that's our goal.
I was using potholes euphemistically. I mean, I'm talking about capital improvements in general.
Exactly.
But you know,
We're doing 101,
Right,
fix a
right,
pothole, get
right.
my son-in-law a job.
right, and that, you know, I mean, I know that is our internal goal, but I know that the big problem is our big capital improvement is the engineering stuff and the costs that are escalating huge. And I think that you're right, there's gotta be some compromise in all those areas to make sure that proper reserve funds are available for them.
Well, I think in the interest of time, since it's 4 o'clock, I'd like to go back to the pensions and see if we could, because these other two are very judgmental as to how much we're gonna put into the roads and
Right.
reserves. So I think the pensions, we need to calculate what we think the unfunded liability is, and we need to hire an actuary to help us give some scenarios so that we can make a decision as to how much that would be. So I think that's where we should spend 10 or 15 minutes on that and then see how much we can get accomplished.
So through the chair, I think that the finance director really has a good suggestion and maybe a way for us to proceed and have staff bring back to this body some analysis and different spreadsheets of how the pie could be split between the three major categories there. Maybe increasing the reserve policy from 35% overall to 40%. What does that look like going forward? Adding additional funding for the capital projects, road repairs, like drainage or the Marsh Road channel, you know, the channel, there's going to be a meeting with residents here tonight about that, or the Marsh Road channel improvements. and then, contribute, how much should we maybe reasonably contribute over the arc to the pension? And just do the spreadsheets and do maybe 2 or 3 scenarios. Is that too much to ask
Well, no, but
staff to do?
item 7 gives a little deeper
Yeah.
quantification,
Mhm.
where we did an actuary to give us some numbers, so he's got to use it.
Is that how these committees always work? They throw it back on staff?
Yeah, we don't
I'm
do
not
any work.
being serious.
We don't do any analysis. You want to do the analysis? We could form an ad hoc, through the chair, you could form an ad hoc committee to work with staff, to kind of, work with them to do some of the analysis.
What we could do is, we can come back with, an analysis of what the revenues and expenditures are over the course of 5 years, what the priorities are for some capital projects, make sure we're, filling the potholes, an idea if there's any gap. Bring that back to this committee, say, okay, this is our funding gap over the next 5 years for our capital projects. We can go out and look at reserve policies of neighboring communities and say, this is the minimum, this is the maximum we found, this is typical, here's what we recommend. Where we have a challenge, though, is the contributions to the pension and the OPEB. This committee's tossed around the interest rate question for a while, what's reasonable, what's unreasonable. There's some that feel the 7.5 from CalPERS is unreasonable, and it should be more like 4, 5, or 6, and others feel, hey, they've been earning quite a bit, what's the problem? So we're not gonna take a stab at that one. We would prefer that you have somebody outside like Joe Nation or Bartel or somebody else come back, give them some direction, say, we think 6% is a reasonable rate of return. What does 6% look like if PERS earned that? And what does 6 or 4 or 5% look like if our OPEB, $6.6 million out there, is changed? And how much would you suggest we contribute and bring that back?
Well, we could have 2 or 3 scenarios that would go the range of whatever the individual members feel is reasonable. I mean, if you think it should be 6, then we could do a 6, and if somebody says it should be 7, then we could do 7, and if somebody thinks it should be 8.
I thought we did this.
4.
I think we came up with 4.
I like 5.5 because that's what Moody's says. So
Well, I mean, we're just doing scenarios. You look at the returns for the last 2 years, 13%, 12%. I mean, it looks like they are doing very well right now, even though they've got a long way to go to make up the deficit.
Well, it's coming out of a hole.
We gotta
It's
look
all
at, we
relative,
gotta look at a
right?
number. Right now, it's just, it's smoke. I mean,
Right, so I mean,
there's 9 million
We
in
need
roads and streets.
you're recommending we
We
get
don't
an
know what the number
actuary to
is.
do scenarios that we think we need to look at.
Yeah, and provide staff with some, fine direction that we can give that actuary, because we gotta develop a proposal, that's gotta go to the city council blesses it, then we hire somebody.
I thought we.
That was for the OPEB.
Yeah, it was just for
For
the
the
OPEB.
OPEB,
Yeah,
okay, so
this
that
is
was
for the
Portola
pen-
Valley, Hillsborough
Yes.
analysis, and we saw that they were doing the 4 to 5.5%, and we all agreed
We-
kind of that was kind of the right
Yeah,
ballpark. Okay.
yeah, so that one's done. The other one is the pension, is the analysis on that. And
We were
that
get-
is more moving targets.
Sorry, we were supposed to have updated numbers in November? Is that not true?
On the OPEB,
On total revenue coming in, I thought the lady that came in to do the analysis, she had mentioned she would have updated numbers, I believe, in November.
You,
Talking about,
the property taxes?
Yeah.
I'll follow up.
we got our new numbers in April
There's, I could swear she said she would have updated numbers in November,
of this coming year.
this year.
So I believe you're talking about HDL
Yes.
properties,
HDL.
which did their property tax analysis. I'll follow up with her on that.
Right.
To verify. But the OPEB we did in April, that was the final analysis, and taking into consideration the new changes to staffing, our employment resolution, everything, that came out, the OPEB. So I think we're okay with that.
Okay,
It's the pension is the one where we're gonna need, because the changes of what proposed with CalPERS, I think maybe that would be, the sensitivity analysis on that is what we're more looking at right now.
Well, Alan, you're locked into 5.5 as being the one we should do? I mean, as far as doing, I'm not saying final, I'm just saying you would like to see the numbers.
Yeah, I'd like to see that because apparently that's, the Moody's, well, if GASB, sorry, is GASB about to come out or have they come out?
No, well, GASB, their requirement is that cities do these actuarials, that they ask these questions, that they look into the demographics, the normal costs and everything. It doesn't require a discount rate. But, you know, we're going off
You
of,
mean they don't specify one,
no, they don't specify discount
even
rates.
though they say someplace here that, oh,
Moody's does,
yeah.
in this report, but yeah, Gatsby basically is going off of what your pension actuary is, and ours is CalPERS, and so they are suggesting, right now it's 7.5. Through their recent meetings, there's a proposal that they could, it's not definite, that in November, they might decide to reduce that to 7.25.
CalPERS, yeah.
Yes, their rate.
But if we did 5.5, 6.5, and 7.5, then we would know the range,
Okay.
and we could make calculations
Yeah.
in between.
Yeah.
If everybody's happy with 3 scenarios, at 5.5, 6.5, and
I like
7.5,
that.
then we can,
Okay.
Look at the number.
Well,
I mean, I'm not voting, but
Aren't you glad?
and then this ties into what Robert put on the last page. Establish our own internal side fund,
yeah,
so we can say, okay, we have adequately
provide.
set aside.
provided.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that what you want, George, is our feeling on the,
Yes, and we'll craft on the range, and then we'll craft a proposal letter, and that'll go to the council, and we can do that with the blessing of this committee to move forward, to at least address this issue, and then once, because you're not gonna decide them all in a vacuum, you gotta kind of decide them all at once.
or do we want to have somebody make a motion? Can the chair make a motion?
There's not is there a motion?
So you're saying you're gonna hire
An actuary.
nation?
So an actual,
Or
go out for
someone,
bid.
because he's been not available.
So you're gonna go to an actuary?
Right.
And recast CalPERS numbers are already at 7.5, they're just a couple years old. But you're gonna recast the numbers at 5.5 and 6.5%?
Correct. And so that actuary, whomever we hire, would have to take into account the 1.1% changes that CalPERS is proposing in 2015, plus the potential of their change in the discount rate against our suggestions of what a discount rate might be and what the impact is on our assets, and calculate the gap between the actuarial value and the market value of our assets. And that gap is what we need to fund in that internal side fund.
So
Uh,
you want to make a motion to do that?
Okay, so,
So you move that we go 5.5, 6.5, and 7.5
yeah,
of the PERS.
We have 7.5 already.
Yeah, we have-
It's just over.
We know that one,
So it's
right?
5.5 and 6.5.
Right, this is the floor, and then
we
something in between.
calculate essentially what Robert just put here at the end, that is, we figure out, this is what our true, you know, assuming that,
Assuming these are discount rates.
yeah, and then we decide this is the true liability that we have, and then start working toward
Or figuring out how we work towards.
having the assets required to.
Right, and I know I talked to an actuary this morning by happenstance, and he said that in the private sector, they do have rules as to how much you fund based on what the numbers show as far as deficits.
Right.
Now, I think that might be something we could look at as guidance, we don't have to follow it.
Did you just make a motion?
That's our
Yeah,
annual.
second that motion.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passed.
So getting this accomplished
Yes.
will take a couple of months. So it won't show back up on your agenda probably until later in the fall.
Well, we meet
Every other month.
every other month, so that we can
Be
get it.
right on target for the next meeting.
No,
Well,
it won't be done by September.
Yeah. It's gotta go to the council, it's gotta get budget amendments, it's gotta go.
Well, the council moves like lightning so far.
Move things along.
Now you gotta ask the council for money.
So move it.
Ask them to approve it.
And Mayor, the council moves like lightning, don't they?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, sometimes they do. In hindsight, they should take a break or take a pause.
But I think, you know, the public most certainly was very sensitive, and, you know, you can hear it, you know, how, we know you have a surplus. I heard that twice. And that's, you know, they're not liking this, and you've got to justify these numbers. And if you can't, and we need to be able to say, we've reviewed it, we've done the analysis, we've gone through this, everything's protected, we've chosen a frugal number and in your best interest and be able to back it up.
I couldn't agree more.
And if you can't, you know, you're gonna be standing at the podium and it's not gonna be pretty.
And if in 2 years, we hear from CalPERS and everything's going great and the discount rate's going wonderful, we've got this internal side fund set up, it's not restricted to that use only because it's strictly internal, it's not a trust fund. So we can move that back to the general fund if at some point we don't need that.
And we should have the
What
language.
what
that says
Diane, I think, is alluding to is perception versus reality.
Mhm.
And people perceive, quite frankly, they don't care about CalPERS, they probably can't spell it, they care about the potholes. Coming back to my final thing, but I think I'm right on with you. When you-
Well, you're right on it, Chicago, man.
Hey, I'm right on it. No, I'm an old Irish border, I mean,
That's right.
that I've been hearing the same things you have from.
Yeah, streets, lighting, security, beautification, I mean, it's very clear. Show me. It's, we're back to, what is it, Iowa, Indiana?
Yeah.
Missouri,
Show me
show
state.
me.
Show me state.
Right? Show me what you've done, prove to me you need it, how have you spent the money? And I think that that's the responsible way to go about it, so. And, you know, the roads are better, I have to admit. So we're getting there,
Yeah.
but we have to be frugal.
And
Well, now, the
this-
parcel tax is in November, so if we don't get these numbers fairly quickly, it's not, they're gonna be academic. For just convincing people what we need to set aside.
Yes.
Is that right?
Well, put it another way, they probably are academic until we know what the status of the parcel tax is.
Well, no, but it's circular. I mean, if you have numbers back at the parcel tax, it's a lot better to get it passed than if we don't, so it's.
I think in
we
order
don't
to
have
pass
to
the
make a
parcel tax,
decision.
people really just want to know that you are
We're gonna use it.
funding it, your, every penny of their tax that they pay by renewing this parcel tax goes towards public safety and road repairs. And they feel good about that. And that's all it is. I've worked on the last two, and it's been a joy for me to go door to door and talk to people, and they want the parcel tax because they believe in the public safety feature. They want to pay for the police. They want to pay for the extra protection and safety, have their alarms tied to their houses, and they want their roads, kept up. They want the drainage problem solved. They want, to know that we have public works out there maintaining the parks, weeding our roads, and keeping our town beautiful. So that's what I think, and I think it's easy for people to vote for the parcel tax. Some people not, but because of that, they know every penny goes to help keep our town beautiful and safe.
Well, some of the things that came up in the meeting from another council member to charge the
Yeah,
circus club,
Yeah, we don't.
it was not feasible.
We're going to reconsider.
So I really think we need to,
We're gonna reconsider that on
August
August
7th.
7th.
Could we get the RFP by August 7th?
No.
I think the need is already, for the parcel tax, that I think is taken care of. I think that's already, we have that. This, and we know what we're using it for. This is for additional of our funding after the fact, and I think we're addressing it. We would love to have this ready for next, but getting a consultant, taking this to council, writing the RFP is gonna take some time.
We'll move that along for sure.
Right.
But I think there's a story to tell here, Mr. Chair, to your point of getting the word out to the public, is that, we're doing our fiduciary responsibility, and that the study, the actuarial analysis and everything is part of that.
Yes.
Can we help you?
Oh, yeah, he's our engineer.
Oh, he's already.
Coming in with good news.
Guy wants a purchase order.
Now.
We just picked up another million for miscellaneous.
All right, well, we've done are we accomplished everything you want us to do, George?
Yes, sir, we have.
So we can adjourn.
Well,
Alan?
I just have one observation. I just have one observation about this. Going through all this stuff, it's clear to me nobody really understands all this actuarial stuff. It's just beyond,
That's correct.
okay, and I couldn't help but thinking often as I was struggling through this, God, I wish we had a defined contribution pension plan like we have at Stanford University. Because at the end of the month, employee puts in X%, Stanford puts in Y, and there's no actuarial stuff.
Well, that's what Ronald Reagan did in '85 on the federal government.
And
Changed the program for pension.
And I just wonder if we couldn't somehow do a study of the pros and cons of what it would take to say new employees would be on a defined contribution plan.
And essentially get out of CalPERS
Yeah, for new employees.
for them.
For new employees.
Well, there's a proposition that's being talked about that will stay, I think you have to change the law.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's being, trying to, I just read an article on it this last week, and he wouldn't tell me who's funding it, because that's the big key, how much money they can raise, but there is, I'll try and send you that article. I couldn't email it to you, they prohibited me from emailing it, because I was gonna send it to the committee. But I will print it and see that you get it.
So send it to
Print
Ron.
it, scan it, then send it.
Well, you know, it just, when you look at the poor guys in Detroit who worked there for 20 or 30 years,
Getting
and
nothing.
they got nothing to show for it, if they had, on a defined contribution, they would be, they'd have, you know, $1 million or something.
Well, the
stored.
court did not take away the pension benefits for Vallejo. So even though they went through bankruptcy, so, you know, the employees sometimes are confident that they'll get it no matter what.
Yeah, it's a state obligation at that point. And in order to get out of CalPERS as a retirement pension system, they require a 100% buyout at an interest rate that's higher than what they,
What's the interest?
I think what they projected, the 7.5, I think they want to
That's
buy.
the termination number that's in there.
Well, this is not terminating, I'm not suggesting we do it for people already in it, I'm saying for new hires.
That's correct. They require you to pay out all of your existing employees that are legacy employees in order to leave the system.
Well, can't you do them pay as you go? Well, let's get somebody to study that for us and just see if there's any hope there. Otherwise,
Well, it's been kicked around in Georgia.
Other agencies have tried to vacate CalPERS, and that's the termination number that CalPERS provides them.
And it's in.
Does anybody do it?
Millions.
There's some cities that aren't in it, but.
Yeah, but they were never,
Few.
yeah.
Yeah.
Does the Charter City help you?
No.
You still have to pay the issue's the number.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
It's always doable.
All right, well, any other questions before we adjourn? Bob?
My question before about is that how we always do things, give it back to staff. In boards that I've served on, typically something that is this, I'm not gonna say complex, I don't know that it's complex, but there's a lot of limitations. Typically that's given to ad hoc, somebody that people that are interested in doing it, and they come back with one or two or three proposals, so that you don't start from zero, because you can't start with.
Well, the actuaries are, no, we can talk about the, all three of them.
I'm talking about what to do with the $4.5 million, where you've got a lot of permutations, so that subcommittee comes back and says, we've looked at this, and here's a couple of proposals for you to chew on. And then you're not starting with a blank chalkboard, and you have a much better chance of progressing, I think. So that was my reason.
Are you
Apparently it's not done around here.
Are you volunteering?
I was certainly volunteered for that. My next question is, I mean, it's up to you to decide what you're gonna do that. My next question is, I've been to enough city council meetings to hear the council members talk about things that they didn't do. And at the top of this, it seemed, at the top of my kind of attention span there is the other revenue. So I'm going back over earlier financial statements, we used to make a lot of money on this road impact tax. And it went away, Doc we said we made a mistake, well, but it hasn't been revisited. It would seem to me that analyzing the other possible revenue sources and running them to ground, which will probably involve the city attorney, would be a proper and maybe a high priority thing for this committee to do. Now, whether we have to be directed to do that by the boss here, or the boss there, or whether we can volunteer to do it.
Well, I would think that would be
I don't know, but-
separate and apart from our mission today.
I didn't say it wouldn't be. I'm
Yeah,
saying,
I think it- 'cause I
I
think
think
you
it's
put
a
that into
high
our-
priority that I've seen them talk about it. We haven't
Right.
looked at that, we haven't, and here we are. It's not, it hasn't come up on an agenda in here yet. I just think it should be moved to the, kind of the top of the water cooler.
It's gonna take a while to do.
Right, it will take a while to do.
It is part of what the council's priorities and something they talk about in their workshop, is we need to identify any and all potential other revenue sources to include a rejuvenation of the road impact fee, which was killed because of some legal opinion in-house. But it's enacted in other communities and works well. We have the construction time limit ordinance that has penalties if not being
Right.
appropriately enforced out there, that we could get revenue from there. False alarms, we could get revenue from false alarms in the community. There's other revenue sources out there. The council said, that's a priority, we need to do that. We need to do that also in conjunction with utility users tax or any other potential taxing alternatives. And so that's part of the strategy for the early spring for them to address, and it will be in concert, I suspect, with the finance committee.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, and I think you raise a really good point, is how can we better utilize the brain power on the finance committee?
Absolutely.
And, you know.
Well, we'd be happy to work with
from
a
council.
subcommittee
Yeah.
to walk through some of these issues and do that,
And start talking about it.
yeah.
Well,
So-
Bob, you want to be a member, and you would, Alan?
Okay.
And we need 3 because we don't
No.
have.
No.
Two.
Only two.
Good.
Three's a quorum.
Yeah.
We're back on the.
Three's a
on the-
crowd.
You're back on
We
the,
heard that earlier today.
spending the 4.5 million.
Three's a crowd.
Right, that's it, yeah.
Three's a
Not-
crowd.
not the-
Not the others, because that's not, I don't think we.
Well, I was
No
talking about
ground issues.
Yeah.
pension funding.
Now, we're talking about use of the reserves and how to do that, and the capital projects.
I know, yeah, I'd be happy to work with anybody that wants to.
And it can just be 2 members, because that's not a quorum.
I heard one.
Diane, you want it?
I-
Well, I think
He's got a different
he's got a different
It's
issue.
different.
He's got a different agenda.
I'm happy to do it.
Perfect.
So you
And
and
I'm
Bob,
gonna also bring up the community center, which I
All right.
love to have this town have, which I've seen in every other community making a lot of money independent of tax.
Yeah, it's a revenue
And it's a
alternative for
okay,
people
then
as well.
why don't you direct, I'd like to see you be really clear with your direction of the ad hoc committee, and it'll go in the minutes as to what you're directing the ad hoc committee to focus on at this point.
Well, I think they'd take a rough cut on how to allocate the 4.8 billion
The reserves.
reserves between those 3 elements. And give us at least 2 options on each of the 3 elements.
Mr. Chair, I would suggest maybe just the 2, because your other one is that you've already provided a motion to get actuarial
Right.
involved. So just looking at these 2 particular issues,
Capital
Okay.
projects and the 15% emergency and the 20% unrestricted reserve.
and direct that committee to work with Robert in conjunction to try and
How
flush
can you,
all
how
those
can
things
you
out.
only look at 2 of the 3 issues? I'm coming
Well,
to
the
that.
actuaries do the third.
I
The
think
actuaries
you
doing
can.
that.
But you can't make can you make a recommendation? Okay, all right.
Whether they were listening.
I'm sorry, what are you saying, Bob? You can make a recommendation.
We can just look at the 2 without having to deal with the
Right,
pension at
okay.
this point.
And then you get the third one by the third.
Are you
person.
satisfied with your
Discuss it.
direction? All right, with that,
That's
suggest we
the answer
adjourn.
of the two. You cannot, you can't go after
Throw
3
it at
targets.
once.
Yeah, you can't go after 3 targets. But those 2, we should be able to at least
All right.
lessen the
If
cushion.
we could be of any help, let us know. I guess, although we
Well,
gotta be
no,
careful.
they can't talk to you.
No.
No,
just
no, it's these, you know, they will
Don't
return.
position yourself to second.
You're gonna have to go to the refresher
Wait a minute.
course on the brown
Where's
eye.
Bill? Already.
Bring Bill back in.
So cool.
You just had one.
See,
Hey, I was on the commission for 6 years and we operated just fine. In fact, I got an exemption for the commission to meet Friday.
Thank you.
Okay, we need to do a motion to adjourn.
I moved that we adjourn, all in favor?
Perfect.